You're listening to the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast. On today's episode of the podcast, we preview the ODI series between Australia and New Zealand. It's the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast, and let's get started. Let's have a look at the ODI Series Fixture between Australia and New Zealand. 3 ODIs in this ODI series between Australia and New Zealand. All 3 ODIs will be played in Cairns at the Kalali's Stadium. The first ODI will be on September the 6th. The second ODI will be on September the 8th. And the third and final ODI of the series will be on September the 11th. Let's have a look at the ODI stats between Australia and New Zealand. Head-to-head in ODIs overall, Australia are leading that with 92 wins to New Zealand's 39. Both teams' records in Australia and ODIs. Australia lead that, 43 wins to Australia, 18 to New Zealand. Leading run scorer, Ricky Ponting with 1,971 runs. Leading wicket taker, Glenn McGrath with 59 wickets. Most dismissals, Adam Gilchrist with 62. Most catches, Alan Border with 33. Most matches, Steve Waugh with 60. And the first ODI match between Australia and New Zealand was back in 1974. Let's have a look at both Australia's and New Zealand's ODI squads. Let's have a look at Australia's ODI squad and talk about some of the challenges facing Australia in this ODI series against New Zealand. So Australia's squad for this series against New Zealand is Aaron Finch, Sean Abbott, Ashton Agar, Alex Carey, Cameron Green, Josh Hazlewood, Josh Inglis, Marnus Labuschagne, Glenn Maxwell, Steve Smith, Mitchell Starc, Marcus Stoinis, David Warner, and Adam Zampa. Now, the Australian squad's pretty much the same as it was against Zimbabwe. The only change to the squad was during the Zimbabwean series, where Mitchell Marsh picked up an ankle injury in the first game, so Josh Inglis came in to replace him from Game 2 onwards. So he keeps his spot in this squad. That's the only change, really. The rest of the squad's pretty much the same as it was against Zimbabwe, heading into this ODI series against New Zealand. Now, Australia will be determined to make amends for the last game defeat against Zimbabwe to finish off that ODI series recently. And it was a bit of a shock to the system for everyone that Australia lost against Zimbabwe in that last game. But upsets happened in the game of cricket, and Zimbabwe played better in that last game, whereas Australia didn't. They didn't bat well, but they did well with the ball to try and win the game from nowhere. But in the end, Zimbabwe deserved their victory. And we've already discussed that at length when we reviewed the Australia and Zimbabwe series about that famous win for Zimbabwe. But for Australia, they'll be hurting. They'll be disappointed that they didn't win the series 3-0. But this ODI series is a brand new series for them against New Zealand. It's time for them to be looking to improve and get better as an ODI side in this series against New Zealand. It's always a great series when Australia and New Zealand play in one-day cricket. And this series will be very competitive. And Australia will be up for the challenge, and they'll be determined to win this series and probably win this series 3-0 if they can. Obviously, they didn't quite do that against Zimbabwe when they lost that last game. But for Australia, this series is very crucial, and there's a lot of things that they need to look at to improve on as a one-day side in general, but also individual players need to improve and get better and really take this opportunity to do well in this series. Now, with 14 ODIs remaining for Australia before that Cricket World Cup in India next year, these games against New Zealand will be critical for Australia to improve as a one-day side before that World Cup. Now, this Australian team is a good team. They've got some good players, but there are some areas to improve on, and there's some players who are playing for their spot in this ODI side. And, you know, they need to take this opportunity with both hands. Now, Australia have indicated that during this series against New Zealand, they will make some changes to the team and tinker around with different combinations, batting orders or bowling attacks. We shall see what happens there. But for Australia, they will face a lot of challenges in this series, and we're going to talk about some of those challenges now. Let's talk about the batting first. Now, they're going to face a lot of challenges with the bat, Australia, Now, in the last game against Zimbabwe, they had that batting collapse and got bowled out for 141, and it was a terrible display of batting. Hopefully for Australia, they will learn a lot from that performance and really look at the areas that they need to get better at. Be a bit more disciplined, be patient, bat smarter, and do the basics right with the bat. And take your time and get through the tough periods. As we say in cricket, get through the tough periods as a batsman, and it will become easier. Unfortunately for Australia in that game against Zimbabwe, they didn't quite do that. So hopefully they can do that against New Zealand in this series. But for them, the biggest challenge is how to score runs against this good quality New Zealand bowling attack, the likes of Bolt, Southey and Ferguson. Not going to be easy. They're very quality bowlers, and New Zealand will rely on them heavily in this series to take the wickets and try and put Australia under pressure during this series. So for the Australian batsmen, that's the biggest challenge. Now, for Australia, in the ODI series against Zimbabwe, they did very well in the first two games, but the last game they had that massive batting collapse, as we all know. Now, for Australia, I want to see them do the basics well with the bat in this series. And as I mentioned, some players need to score some runs in this series. Aaron Finch, we'll talk about him a bit in a moment. He's one who's under pressure to score some runs. Marcus Stoinis, and also Alex Carey as well. We'll talk about them a bit later. But for Australia, it's about just doing the basics right. Building partnerships, rotating the strike, converting starts into big scores, don't lose wickets at regular intervals, and play with that positive intent, look to score, and look to put the bowlers under pressure. Because I feel like with Australia's batting, they can definitely put New Zealand's bowlers under pressure. Now, New Zealand will rely heavily on Bolt, Southey, and Ferguson. If Australia can get through them and not lose too many wickets against those bowlers, then New Zealand's other bowlers, they can score runs off them, like Daryl Mitchell, the all-rounder, James Neesham, Mitchell Satner, and Michael Bracewell, obviously, who are the other bowlers to come in after those main bowlers of Bolt, Southey, and Ferguson. So the other bowlers that New Zealand have are not as potent as those main bowlers that they have. So if Australia can get through the main bowlers and get through to the other bowlers, then they can score runs and put them under pressure. Because New Zealand, they're not going to test Australia all that much with the spin department because they've got Mitchell Satner and Michael Bracewell. I was quite surprised that the New Zealand team did not select Ish Sodhi, who's a very good leg spinner and can take wickets. I thought he would be a better option to test Australia in terms of the spin department. So I think Australia can get on top of the New Zealand spinners and put them under pressure with the aggressive approach that Australia applies when they're batting. Now, we mentioned Aaron Finch. This series against New Zealand is critical for him. Pretty much, he's playing for his one-day career now. The patience has worn thin. Many people are agitated, they're frustrated, they're mad, and I can understand that because, it's a straightforward decision. When you look at it at the end of the day, he's not contributing, he's out of form, he's in a form slump. If he wasn't captain, it will be a straightforward decision. But he is captain, so he's not going to be dropped. This series is critical for him. He needs to score some runs, Aaron Finch, and for him it's just about to go out there and try and bat time. Bat time, look to get in, get set, and score some runs. Otherwise, if he doesn't do that, then pretty much he may not play in the ODI series later on in the summer against England, which will be in November. That's just after the T20 World Cup. And it probably is expected that he may retire from T20s after the T20 World Cup this year. And then he could make the decision, if he doesn't score any runs against New Zealand in this ODI series, to probably retire from ODIs as well. But we shall see what happens in the future. But he needs to score some runs, and he's one batsman that's under pressure. But his record against New Zealand, Aaron Finch, is not great. He's played 10 ODIs against New Zealand. He's averaging 17.2, and he's scored 172 runs with one half century. So for Aaron Finch, the odds of him scoring runs in this series against New Zealand aren't looking good because his overall stats in ODIs against New Zealand aren't that great. But stats are stats. For him, it's just about to go out there and just bat and just be a batsman, not think about the captaincy. Go out there, do your job, and score runs. It's easier said than done to say that, but for Aaron Finch, he's under lots of pressure. Let's hope he can rise to the occasion and score some runs in this series against New Zealand. Now, I mentioned other batsmen like Marcus Stoinis and Alex Carey. They are under pressure as well in this series. Obviously, Alex Carey is batting up the order at number 4, which I think is a bit too high for Alex Carey. I think he should be batting down the order. But for him, he's been given an opportunity to bat up the order in this Australian team. He has opened the batting before for Australian one-day cricket when David Warner was out of the side when he was banned in 2018, that period. He's also done it for South Australia as well in one-day cricket. So they're thinking about Carey as a potential opener in the future, maybe. That's why Australia are batting him at number 4. I would like to see Australia probably move him down the order. I think he's best suited down the order because he's a finisher. He's not a top order player. And we saw in the Zimbabwe series, he struggled. And in the last game, he played a terrible shot to get out because he wanted to hit boundaries and force the pace. Whereas if you're coming in at number 4, usually a few wickets have fallen quite early, like in the last game against Zimbabwe. What you need to do as a number 4 is to take up time, look to rotate the strike and build a partnership. He was out there with David Warner and he was looking to be aggressive and looking to hit boundaries. That wasn't the right thing to do at that moment. So I don't think he's best suited at number 4. I would like to see Australia bat him at number 7. So he's one batsman that needs to take his opportunities to score some runs. Otherwise, there's Josh Inglis in the side. He could take the place of the gloves from Carey and bat up the order at number 4 if Australia want to do that. So he's got to score some runs, Alex Carey. Marcus Stoinis is the same. I want to see Marcus Stoinis take this opportunity because the last few years in one-day cricket for Marcus Stoinis haven't been great. He hasn't scored a half-century for a while. I think he hasn't scored a half-century since 2019. So that's not good. He's taken the odd wicket with the ball, but he's under pressure as well because you've got Cameron Green in the side who's going well and taking wickets and scoring runs and doing very well in this one-day side. So he adds a lot of value to this one-day side, Cameron Green, than Marcus Stoinis at the moment. So he's under pressure. He needs to score some runs as well. And also I would like to see from Australia as well, move Glenn Maxwell up the order. Now, I already talked about Alex Carey batting at number 4. I would like to see him bat at number 7. And I would like to see Glenn Maxwell be probably that number 4 or at number 5 because it's no point having Glenn Maxwell coming in when there's 40 overs to go in the innings. You're better off sending Glenn Maxwell in earlier to face as many overs as he can to make an impact on the match. So I would like to see Australia throughout this series against New Zealand not be stuck in their routines or not be stuck in their structures. Be flexible. Move Glenn Maxwell up the order if the game situation requires that. Try him at number 4. Try him at number 5 and give him that responsibility to score runs because he can do it, Glenn Maxwell. He is a game changer. He is a match winner for Australia. But I think he's just wasted at number 7. And obviously, move the batting order around a bit, try different combinations. But for Australia, the important thing in this series against New Zealand is that the batsmen need to be consistent, need to score runs, and if they do that, they can put the New Zealand bowlers under pressure. But that's very important for Australia. They need to do the basics well with the bat. If they do the basics well with the bat, I think they can have success against the New Zealand bowlers in this ODI series. Now, let's talk about some of the challenges facing the Australian bowlers in this series against New Zealand. Now, there's not too many challenges that the Australian bowlers will face in this ODI series against New Zealand. The Australian bowlers bowled well against Zimbabwe. They looked pretty good. They were in form. Cameron Green had a good series. Josh Hazlewood, Mitchell Starc, Adam Zampa. So all those bowlers are firing, and the Australian bowling attack's looking good. The balance of the attack is quite good, Everyone's taking wickets and doing their role. So I don't think they'll face too many challenges in this series. I think they will pose some questions to the New Zealand batsmen in this ODI series and will put New Zealand under pressure with the ball during this series as well. So for the Australian bowlers, it's just about doing the basics and just repeating the basics. I think that's very important to remember to do the basics well. And I think for the Australian bowlers, throughout the Zimbabwe series, and also into this series against New Zealand, it's important to do the basics well, and they've been doing the basics well. Bowling dot balls to build pressure on the batsmen. And they've been executing their plans and skills for the ball. And they've taken their opportunities as well in the field, Australia, in terms of their fielding. Obviously, making sure that they back up the bowlers and put pressure on the batsmen. As we know, Australia's a very good fielding side. And if Australia do that, do the basics well, then the Australian bowlers can have success and can take wickets against this New Zealand batting lineup. Because I feel like if they do get some of the key batsmen out from New Zealand, like a Williamson, a Martin Guptill, a Tom Latham, a Devon Conway, then they can put New Zealand under pressure with the rest of the batting group. And maybe New Zealand may be a bit vulnerable in terms of their batting, because their batting of late, New Zealand, during the series against Ireland, Scotland, the West Indies, at times it's been a bit shaky. In all those games, they had some batting collapses and the batsmen didn't really do well. But they were able to get out of it and win those games and get the win. But for New Zealand, they will be tested up against this Australian bowling lineup. So for Australia, it's just about doing the basics well and, just keep doing the basics, keep nailing the basics. It's very simple. This Australian bowling attack's very good. It's high quality and they will test the New Zealand batsmen. So there's not too many challenges for Australia in this series with the ball, but it's all about just trying to bowl the best you can, do your job, and hopefully perform at your best. So for Australia, there are plenty of challenges with both bat and ball in this series, but if they can overcome the challenges, and if they can learn from their past experiences from the Zimbabwe series heading into the New Zealand series, then they can have a very good series against New Zealand. Australia have always had good success against New Zealand in one-day cricket in Australia. They always play well against the Trans-Tasman rivals. And it will be no different in this series. But for Australia, overall, I would like to see them just nail the basics with both bat and ball and try to be consistent. That's the important thing here. Be consistent from game 1 to game 2 to game 3. Consistency is the key for Australia. I would like to see them be consistent. I would like to see the batsmen bat a lot smarter and responsible with their batting and take that responsibility upon their shoulders, unlike the last game against Zimbabwe. And the bowlers, I would like to see them keep doing what they've been doing, following from the Zimbabwe series. So for Australia, they're definitely favourites to win this ODI series against New Zealand. But for them, if they can rise to the occasion, then I think they can get the job done in this ODI series against New Zealand. Let's have a look at New Zealand's ODI squad and talk about some of the challenges facing New Zealand in this ODI series against Australia. Now, New Zealand's squad for this ODI series against Australia is Kane Williamson, Finn Allen, Trent Boult, Michael Bracewell, Devon Conway, Lockie Ferguson, Martin Guptill, Matt Henry, Tom Latham, Daryl Mitchell, James Neesham, Glenn Phillips, Mitchell Satner, Ben Sears, and Tim Southey. That's the squad that New Zealand have selected for this ODI series against Australia. Now, when you have a look at that squad, it looks a pretty strong squad. You've got the likes of Williamson, Boult, Southey, Ferguson, Guptill, Latham, Conway. It's a pretty strong squad. Obviously, some names that I haven't heard of before. Obviously, Ben Sears is one name that I haven't heard before. But it'll be interesting to see how he goes in this ODI series if given the opportunity. The rest of them have been around the New Zealand side for quite a few years now. As we know of New Zealand, they're a pretty good one-day side. They've made it to 2 World Cup finals back-to-back, 2015 and 2019. So they're a very good side. They know what to do in one-day cricket. They're competitive, and they'll give Australia quite a fight and be competitive in this series against them. But for New Zealand, the challenge for them in this whole ODI series is how they go about winning an ODI series in Australia, because that's the one thing that's eluded them for quite some time, as New Zealand. Now, New Zealand have won a test series in Australia. That was a few years ago in the 80s, but they've never won an ODI series in Australia. And that's one thing that's been eluding them for some time. Will 2022-23 be the time that this New Zealand team can win an ODI series in Australia? Now, the odds are against them, but you never say never, and they can probably get the job done. They've got some very good players, but it's all about that belief and trying to break down that mental barrier of not fearing Australia and saying, right, yep, Australia are very tough to beat in their own backyard, but we're a good side, we can beat them. And Australia can be beaten. We saw what happened against Australia and Zimbabwe in the last game. You know, any team can beat Australia at home. It's just you need that belief, and you need to execute your skills with both bat and ball to do that. But for New Zealand, the biggest challenge is that the pressure being placed on them, because many people know that they haven't had great success when it comes to one-day cricket in Australia. Let's have a look back at the history in bilateral ODI series against Australia and New Zealand. Now, New Zealand, since 2004-05, haven't had a great time in ODI series in Australia. Now, the 2004-05 series, that was drawn at 1-1. That was the best of 3 ODIs. That was drawn at 1-1. The next series after that was 2007-08 in Australia. Australia won that series 2-0, best of 3. The 2008-2009 series was drawn. That was 2-2, best of 5. The 2016-17 series, Australia won that 3-0 out of 3 ODIs. And the last ODI series, which was in 2019-20, Australia won that series 1-0, best of 3. But the first game went ahead, but as we know now, the last 2 games were cancelled for obvious reasons. So for New Zealand, that's a bit of a record of their past bilateral ODI series in Australia. And they've only won 3 games and they've lost 9. They haven't won an ODI match in Australia since that 2008-2009 series, where they won 2 games in that 5-match series. So they haven't had a great time of it, as I mentioned, but can 2022-23 be that turning point? You know, we shall see. We shall see what happens in this series. Now, New Zealand have been in good form. They've won some ODI series this year. They've won against Ireland 3-0 recently. That was a few months ago. Now, New Zealand didn't have their full-strength squad playing in that game against Ireland, but that scoreline, New Zealand winning the series 3-0, is a bit misleading, because Ireland actually played well in that whole entire ODI series and gave New Zealand a run for their money. The first game, New Zealand won by 1 wicket. The second game, they won by 3 wickets. And the third and final game of that series between New Zealand and Ireland, New Zealand won by 1 run. So that series was a close series, and it was good to see Ireland be competitive and really challenge New Zealand, even though New Zealand did not have some of their main players playing in that series. Then they went to Scotland. They played a one-off ODI against Scotland. They won that quite easily by 7 wickets. And then the last ODI series that New Zealand have played, that was in the Caribbean. They won that series 2-1 against the West Indies. But that series, they struggled a bit at times, and they lost the first game by 5 wickets. The second game, they won by 50 runs. And the third game, they were able to win by 5 wickets. So New Zealand were able to come back and win the last 2 games, but they struggled in the first game, and they struggled at times during that series. Those opponents that New Zealand played against, Ireland, Scotland, the West Indies, they're all at different levels in terms of their development as a cricket team. But the series against Australia and playing against Australia will be their biggest test so far in 2022. Now, let's talk about the batting and bowling challenges. But first of all, let's talk about the batting challenges. What are some of the challenges facing New Zealand with the bat in this series? The biggest challenge for them is how to go about scoring runs against the Australian attack. Now, the Australian attack of Stark, Hazelwood, obviously Adam Zampa and Cameron Green, is not going to be easy. Obviously, there's no Pat Cummins playing for Australia in this ODI series. He's been rested. But still, it's still a pretty good attack. And they're in good form, obviously. They were in good form against the Zimbabweans, the Australian attack. And no doubt they'll hit the ground running against New Zealand as well. So, the New Zealand batsmen, you have the usual suspects. You have Martin Guptill, you have Tom Latham, you have Devon Conway, you have Kane Williamson as the main batsman to really stand up and to do their job and score runs for New Zealand. Now, looking at the stats in terms of the run scorers, with the Ireland, Scotland and the West Indies series combined, Martin Guptill's out in front with 297 runs, averaging 42. He's already scored a century. That was 115. Then you've got Finn Allen, who got 273 runs in that time. And Michael Bracewell, who's burst onto the scene, as we know what he did on Test debut against England at Trent Bridge. He scored 241 runs, a century in that time, 127 not out. That was against Ireland, I believe, in one of those matches to get New Zealand over the line. And then you have Daryl Mitchell, who's been playing really good of late. Obviously, good Test cricketer, as we know, following that series in England. He had a golden series there, 198 runs, highest score of 74 not out. Then you have Tom Latham, 189 runs, high score of 69. You have Glenn Phillips, 110 runs, high score of 47. Devon Conway, he hasn't played much matches during the Ireland or Scotland or West Indies tours. He's been rested. He scored 66 runs, high score of 56. Jimmy Neesham, 35 runs, high score of 34 not out. And Kane Williamson's only played one match out of the Ireland, Scotland and West Indies tours that New Zealand have played recently. I think he played only one match in the West Indies and then he didn't play the next two because of injury. So he scored 34 runs and his high score is 34. So for New Zealand, it's very important for their batsmen to score runs. They need Guptill to be firing. They need Kane Williamson to be returning back to some sort of his best. He's been in a bit of a form slump, just like Steve Smith and Virat Kohli. He hasn't been able to score the big runs. Finn Allen is an up-and-coming young player. He's doing well since he's come into the side. Michael Bracewell's done well. Daryl Mitchell, Latham, and Phillips have done well of late. Devon Conway's class, as we know. So they've got some very good batsmen, New Zealand, but it's about them scoring runs and putting Australia under pressure and being competitive. If they can do that, then they've got their bowlers something to bowl at and to be competitive and hopefully put Australia under pressure with the ball if they can. So it's important for New Zealand to make sure that they do the basics right with the bat, build partnerships, rotate the strike, convert the starts into big scores, and don't lose wickets at regular intervals. Because as we saw in some of the ODI series that they played against Ireland, Scotland, and even against the West Indies, they did have some shaky moments with the bat, and they are quite a bit vulnerable. So if Australia can expose their batting lineup, then they will be put under pressure and will be tested. So it's very important for those main batsmen, as I mentioned earlier, to really stand up and score runs in this ODI series. If they do that, then they can put New Zealand into a good position and hopefully be competitive and hopefully try and win some of the games in this ODI series. So for New Zealand, the biggest challenge for them is about how to score runs against this quality Australian bowling attack. If they can overcome that challenge, then there are a good chance of posting competitive totals batting first or chasing down totals in the run chase. But time will tell, and they need to execute on the day, because if they do, then they're a good chance. If they don't, then they're going to struggle. So it's very important for those senior batsmen to stand up for New Zealand and to really put in a good effort in this ODI series against Australia. Now, let's talk about some of the challenges facing the New Zealand bowlers in this ODI series against Australia. Now, New Zealand have a quality attack. They've got Tim Southee, Trent Boult, Matt Henry, and Lockie Ferguson. Pretty good attack. New Zealand can cause some problems to Australia in this ODI series. If New Zealand looked at the last game against Zimbabwe, there are some vulnerability about the Australian batting lineup. They are susceptible to a batting collapse, as we know. It's not surprising to expect that from Australia, a batting collapse, but it does happen every now and again. Now, Tim Southey, Trent Boult, Matt Henry, not Callum Ferguson, sorry, Lockie Ferguson. It's very important for them to strike early with the ball in this series because New Zealand need to take early wickets. They need to put Australia under pressure in the first 10 overs. They can't allow Australia to get off to a flyer, or they can't allow David Warner to get off to a flyer, or if Aaron Finch can get off to a flyer, allow him because they're very dangerous players. And then obviously you've got Smith and Maxwell, and then you've got, Stoinis, and then Carey, and then Cameron Green as well. So for New Zealand, it's very important to take wickets up front and put Australia under pressure. If they can expose Australia's batting lineup, if they can get rid of Aaron Finch early, Aaron Finch is a walking wicket. He's struggling. He's out of touch. He's out of form. His record against New Zealand's not great. We already mentioned that earlier when we talked about Australia. He's averaging 17.2 in 10 matches with only one half century. So if New Zealand can get him out early, then get David Warner out early, expose Steve Smith and then remove him. Same with Alex Carey, which he's been batted at number 4 for Australia of late. Then it's quite vulnerable, really. And then you've got Marcus Stoinis, who's not in good touch. And then you've got Cameron Green, who's come into the side. Obviously a young player. Hasn't really been established in this one-day team of yet. Then you've got Glenn Maxwell, who's coming in at number 7 down the order, which is pretty much low for him, really. But Australia would like him at number 7 to be that finisher. So what I'm trying to say is if New Zealand can get early wickets, they can put Australia under pressure, because I see this bowling attack doing that. But they're going to rely heavily on those 4 bowlers I mentioned, Southey, Boult, Henry and Ferguson. The only question I have for the New Zealand bowling attack is their spin attack. I think their spinners will struggle big time against Australia. Mitchell Sattner and Michael Bracewell do bowl spin, obviously. You can rely on Sattner to bowl some overs. He can take the odd wicket. Michael Bracewell can bowl some part-time off-spin. But they don't have a spinner of Adam Zampa's quality, for example. I was quite surprised that New Zealand did not select Ish Sodhi in this side, because I thought Ish Sodhi would have been a better option to have in the spin department and challenge the Australian batsman, because he's a very crafty bowler, Ish Sodhi, and he's a leggy. But I do see this New Zealand spin attack of Sattner, Bracewell, struggling against the Australian batsmen, because they don't have the same quality as Adam Zampa has. Obviously, Adam Zampa, you can rely on him to tie down an end, take wickets at regular intervals, whereas Sattner and Bracewell, I don't think New Zealand can rely on them to hold up an end and take wickets when needed. So that's why I was quite surprised they didn't pick Ish Sodhi. But anyway, that's how the selectors have gone for New Zealand. So that's the only question I have with the New Zealand bowling attack, is when the main bowlers in Southey, Boult and Henry and Ferguson finish, then you go to the spinners like Sattner or Bracewell. Can they keep the pressure on the Australian batsmen, take wickets and challenge them and really tighten the screws? After New Zealand's done well with the ball up front, taking early wickets, can they keep the pressure on? That remains to be seen. But for New Zealand, they've got a good attack. You know what you're going to get from Southey, Boult, Henry and Ferguson. But as I said, the spin attack's that main concern. Can they do the job? I don't think they can, but we shall see what happens in this series. But for New Zealand, they've got to back their skills. They've got to do the basics well with the ball. They've got to bowl dot balls, build pressure on the Australian batsmen, execute their plans and skills with the ball, take their chances. You can't afford to give second chances to the Australian batsmen like Warner and Smith and Maxwell, etc. Otherwise, they'll make you pay. So for New Zealand, it's all about doing the basics well, and it's all about backing their processes. And if they can expose the top order of the Australian batting lineup, then they're a good chance to really put Australia under pressure with the ball in this series. So for New Zealand, they will face a lot of challenges in this ODI series against Australia. But the main challenge for New Zealand is, can they finally break the drought and finally win an ODI series in Australia? It's gonna be a big challenge for them, But if they can rise to the occasion, if they can really nail the basics with the bat and the ball, play within themselves, back their abilities, then I think they're a good chance. But we know with New Zealand, they're always a good side. They're a fighting side. They're fighters. They don't give up. We saw that in 2019 in the World Cup final. They give it their all. They're going to be competitive. They're going to come out of Australia and really challenge them. So for New Zealand, it's exciting to see them play Australia in Australia. Hopefully they can get the job done, but we have to see what happens in this series. But for New Zealand, it's about embracing this challenge and hopefully they can succeed and have a successful ODI series. Let's predict who's going to win this ODI series and the leading run scorer and leading wicket taker for the series. Now, my prediction for the series winner, based on recent history and based on where I see both teams at the moment, I see Australia winning this ODI series just because of what's happened before, New Zealand's record in Australia. Obviously, New Zealand playing against Ireland, Scotland and the West Indies, those opponents are quite lower in quality compared to Australia. It's going to be a bigger test against Australia. Australia have a full-strength squad. They've got a good bowling attack. The batting group has stumbled a little bit, as we saw against Zimbabwe in that last game. But if Australia can get the top order right, get the combination of the top order right, score runs, then I think they can win this series against New Zealand. So I think Australia, based on that, I think Australia should win this series in the end. But New Zealand will be competitive. They'll challenge Australia and they'll make a good fight of it. But I do feel like the recent history, what's happened before, I think Australia should win this series in the end. Who's going to be the leading run scorer for the series? I think what I saw in the last game against Zimbabwe, I think David Warner's going to have a good series. Just looks like he's in good touch. He scored that 94 in the last game against Zimbabwe, so he looks determined to do well in this series against New Zealand. So I think he could be the leading run scorer. Leading wicket taker, I'm going to go with Josh Hazlewood. I thought he bowled magnificently in the last game against Zimbabwe. I think he's going to have a good series against New Zealand. So I think he should be the leading wicket taker for the series. Those are my predictions for this ODI series. If you're listening to this episode of the podcast on YouTube, let us know in the comments, who do you think will win the series and your predictions for leading run scorer and leading wicket taker for this ODI series. It would be great to hear your predictions and thoughts. After the 2019-20 ODI series was cancelled just after one game and the rescheduled series last year was postponed, Australia and New Zealand finally face off against each other in an ODI series. This ODI series between Australia and New Zealand is important in so many ways. Crucial Cricket World Cup Super League points are up for grabs, but the Chappell Hadley Trophy is up for grabs. Named after two famous cricketing families who had a significant impact on both Australian and New Zealand cricket. Australia have won the trophy 6 times to New Zealand's 4. Both teams will be determined to win this series and will be looking to improve and get better as both teams think about the Cricket World Cup next year in India. But this ODI series between Australia and New Zealand is sure to be a competitive and exciting series. Well, that's all the time we have for this episode. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get the latest episodes of the podcast, and like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Until next time, keep safe and bye for now.